Hello everyone. My name is Elisa Vilhunen and I work at the University of Helsinki, Faculty of Educational Sciences, and also part-time at the University of Turku, Department of Teacher Education. And currently I do research in this Educa flagship project, and a lot of my research revolves around the topic of what does learning feel like in one way or another. Starting with the historical perspective, for a long time, at least in the Western thought, thinking or reasoning and feeling, they were thought as being something separate and even opposing forces. So all this goes back to the classical philosophy and Enlightenment traditions. So traditionally speaking, learning was thought to be something very rational, reliable, focused, universal and objective. So, which means that knowledge was produced by some rational thinking and clear processes independent of feelings. Whereas on the other hand, emotions, they were just some distractions to be avoided, just some noise, misleading bodily experiences and very subjective. So they would just disturb the good judgment and proper thinking. This altogether, of course, then means that a good learner is someone who's very focused and rational and able to minimize these emotional distractions and this noise. However, considering everything that we know today, all of this just doesn't seem to be right. It's quite hard to believe that something as central to our human experience as emotions would be there just for nothing and would be just noise. Because as we know in nature, practically everything serves some function. So let's move forward to the biological perspective of emotions. So in their chapter, Cosmides and Tooby, they say that emotion is a superordinate program whose function is to direct the activities and interactions of the sub-programs governing perception, attention, inference, learning, memory, goal choice, motivational priorities, and so on. So from an evolutionary perspective, emotions are not definitely irrational, but they have developed to enhance the chances of survival and reproduction, as pretty much everything has. So they are just some reactions to external or to internal stimuli, and they actually direct our attention, memory, motivations, expressions, communication, information processing, and so on. So they are not random, they are not distractions, and they are not separate from learning, but they are actually part of the mechanism that actually makes the learning even possible. Before going any further, let's define some concepts first. So we have a lot of these words like emotions, feelings, and moods that in everyday language we use quite interchangeably, typically. But in research, of course, we have to define what we actually mean by everything. So we typically consider emotions as something that they are relatively short, affective episodes caused by a certain stimulus or antecedent, and they have an object. Whereas things such as feelings or moods are more stable and long-lasting, and they do not necessarily have such a clear stimuli or an object. In addition to this, we of course have a lot of terms somehow connected to these, for example, attitudes, motivation, interest, engagement, and so on. And all these together could be considered as something like affective factors that relate to learning. They are not, of course, clear-cut, but like there's a lot of affective things going on in this affective field in terms of learning. And going even further in defining the concepts, when we think about emotions in educational context or in learning, we can even define them further according to their objects or antecedents. So, for example, in learning contexts, we can have these achievement emotions, which are somehow related to success or failure in some learning tasks. For example, you can feel proud for doing well in an exam, or you can feel disappointment, and so on. Then we can have topic emotions, which relate to the actual subjects being studied. So you can feel, for example, disgust if you're dealing with something disgusting, or you can feel hopelessness or many kind of emotions. Then we have epistemic emotions, which have an object focus exactly on the knowledge production, on understanding, on thinking, and so on. So at least in my opinion, they are like very, very interesting in terms of learning, because they are just like curiosity, if you want to know something more, or confusion, if you're confronting something which you don't understand immediately, and so on. And of course, when we're learning together with others in classrooms and so on, there's also, of course, a lot of social emotions always going on that also has an effect on our learning. So for example, we can admire some people, or we can feel ashamed or so on. Then measuring emotions, it's not as simple as one would hope, because they are very subjective, and as I told, they're usually quite short-lived experiences. And traditionally, a lot of things in educational psychology has been measured with these like retrospective designs. So we might ask people like, how did you feel when you were doing something, or yesterday at school? But now we know that there's quite a strong recall bias when we're trying to think like, how did we actually feel in certain situations? And since there's so many things going on all the time, it might be difficult to actually say what you were thinking. So we've been collecting a lot of data with this, what we call experience sampling method, which means that we go to schools in the actual classrooms in authentic learning situations. And then within those learning situations, students answer these shorties, or we try to keep them short at least, questionnaires, like multiple times during the day or during the lessons. So for example, in the left side picture, you can see the students are answering the questionnaire with their cell phones. And there's an example how it might look like. How well do the following words describe your feelings right now? And then they rate if they feel excited, stressed, or bored, or whatever we're interested in. Of course, nowadays, especially upper secondary school students, they do a lot of their schoolwork with their laptops, which makes it, of course, a bit easier to just implement the questionnaires within their learning tasks in the laptop. So that's also how we collect data. So this is how we can capture the emotions in the actual situations without the recall bias. Then a few examples of our actual studies. There's a lot of small numbers and small text. Don't worry, I will walk you through this. So in this study, called Epistemic Emotions and Observations are intertwined in scientific sense-making. So in this study, we had upper secondary school physics students who took part in a learning activity where they had to make sense of a falling phenomenon through several predict, observe, explain cycles. So in practice, this means that they were like watching videos of different like falling objects, and then they tried to explain what they saw and then make predictions for the next phase of this learning activity. And we collected some qualitative data based on their answers in predictions and explanations, and then we also collected this experience sampling method on their emotions. And from the qualitative data, we found 3 groups of students. One we called inflexibles, or maybe better say like they were like stubborn. They were unable to make any elaboration on their like sense-making or knowledge construction. And then we also found, with the latent profile analysis, we found again 2 groups of students. One group of students were quite bored throughout the activity, whereas the other students, they felt surprise, curiosity, and confusion. And then with the cross-tabulation, we found out that actually, if you're feeling bored, you are not able to make even simple observations when we are showing some videos for students, and we were asking like which falls first, and they were just not willing to make any observations. So it's quite clear that it's good for your learning to feel more curiosity and confusion and even surprise sometimes. Then another example, more recent one. So students' emotional responses to mistakes. This was conducted in the university chemistry lab. And in addition to emotions, we asked students if they had made a mistake just prior to the questionnaire. And in this illustration, that's actually, I think it's quite a nice figure illustrating that like each line represents one student, and then you can see how they felt during the mistakes. So from this data, we can see that when the students had made a mistake, they actually felt less excited, less relaxed, more frustrated, and more anxious, which sounds quite something that you would expect. We've all made mistakes. And that's not like that interesting result maybe, but what I think was the most interesting result here is that actually students reported in those learning situations, they reported in 29% that they had made a mistake. So almost in 1/3 of the learning situations in chemistry lab, students had made a mistakes, which means that they actually feel quite frustrated and anxious quite often. Then a 3rd example, this is still a manuscript under review actually, and in this study we studied this concept of optimal learning moment. So we wanted to know if interest, skill, and challenge, skill meaning like competence, perceptions here, if those constructs actually mediate learning from pre-test to post-test performance, as optimal learning moment theory suggests. And we found that if we just look at the correlations, we see that these like students who performed better in those tests, they were feeling interest and skill during the learning period, but they also felt less challenge. But then in the mediation analysis, we could control for the pre-test performance, and there we saw that actually only the situational interest has an effect on the learning performance, which means that like in general, if a person feels, these are also done in the context of physics, so if a person in general feels interested and skillful in physics, they then tend to perform better, quite expected result. But in those exact learning situations, it's not that, or interest does play a role, but in our data, situational competence perceptions or challenge did not predict the learning gain that they achieved during the learning period. Then, okay, keeping things anonymous, this might be my youngest son learning cross-country skiing or might not be. Anyways, bringing all this together, what does learning feel like? Or how does it should feel? You should feel interested on what you're doing, whether it's cross-country skiing or physics or whatever. You should enjoy it, and you typically have a lot of motivation when you're learning something. However, this is on a personal level. So in general, a person who feels interested, enjoys skiing or chemistry, and feels motivated to learning, they learn. However, on a situational level, things look a bit different. So, of course, this is like in addition to everything on the right. So it's okay to feel interested in and enjoy learning, although also in the learning situations. But in addition, you might also often feel challenged, even confused, and frustrated on what you're doing. And these are like very typical experiences when you're learning new stuff, as you can see. So overall, learning is not like a smooth, straightforward, purely positive experience, but you do make mistakes, you do have failures, and it seems like they are these exact moments of discomfort where learning actually happens. As a conclusion, few final thoughts. So first, emotions are not noise, but they are actually part of learning. They guide our attention and meaning making. And learning is not just a rational process. Second, we learn what matters to us. So emotions actually show us what are the important things to learn and remember. So without emotions, learning does not stick that well. So you can consider emotions as like stamps put to those things that you need to remember. Whereas like boredom seems to be like an anti-stamp. You don't learn it if you're bored. Then an important thing, mistakes and failures are very pertinent to learning. And they are like all these negative emotions are also normal in the learning processes. And they can drive deeper understanding. Which brings us to the meta effects, which are very important. This means that meta effects are like emotions about emotions. So it's not just what we feel and what we experience, but how we interpret those feelings. So for example, if you're feeling confused, you can think that, oh, I can't do this. This is too difficult to me. Or if you feel confused, you can realize that, oh, this is difficult, something new, which means I'm learning something. So as a conclusion, learning is not something that happens despite the emotions, but it's actually something that happens through the emotions. So this is what we know so far. And of course, then the next big question is, how should we take all this into consideration in teaching and in teacher education? But this is all for now. Some references, and thank you.